Welcome back to Five Agendas. We're coming back to the feast. So very, very important. And this was actually done over 4 years ago. But one thing that we want to bring out, so we're going to be doing 3 parts for the feast and then a summary for these videos. So the first fundamental thing that we have to share and realize is the feast and its included command for the shedding of the blood of goats and calves are a part of the type's mediatorial covenant. There's a type and an antitype mediatorial covenant, and we're going to be talking about both. The first was the feast, the old, that decayed, waxed old, and vanished away. The concept of a mediatorial covenant is little perceived. The connection between Passover and the mediatorial covenant was the blood on the doorposts. The blood stood as the mediator between the angel of death on the outside and the people on the inside. Similarly, the blood of Christ, the real Passover Lamb, presents his blood as the basis of the new mediatorial covenant on Calvary. The feast, the types, we're going to see how they relate to the man clothed in linens, past, present, and yet coming, antitypical fulfillment as the great high priest. A thought question is, do the feasts actually relate to the two immutable things that Paul spoke of in Hebrews 6:18, the necessity and the necessary? Okay, keep in mind that these two immutable things are related to what was decreed and the oath from Psalms 2:7 and 110 verse 4. Okay, the decree, thou art my son. And then the oath, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So the biblical fact number 1 remains constant. The decreed aspect of the Son relates to the once for all sacrifice he made on the cross. Therefore, the necessity, he being verily the Son of God and the Son of Man, our Passover Lamb. Biblical fact number 2, following Calvary, the priest aspect, however, has 2 phases, just like the type. And it relates to an antitypical ministration of a mediatorial covenant that was both pre and post, before and after, Daniel 8:14. The pre-phase was the antitypical daily, the hadamid, that is Christ's resurrection, and then the fulfillment of Daniel 8:14. This means Christ was, as high priest, ministering in the heavenly sanctuary prior to the fulfillment of the 2300 years of Daniel 8:14. Biblical fact number 3, the post phase is the antitypical yearly ministration, the Yom Kippur, the final atonement. This commenced after the 2300 years of Daniel 8:14. This antitypical yearly ministration with Christ as great high priest, it ratifies the daily ministration as per the type in Leviticus 4:16. Otherwise, Hebrews 8:5 has no meaning. This yearly ministration, Paul said, involves a cleansing, katharizo, purification of the heavenly sanctuary and the true tabernacle, not made with hands. A cleansing to be of heavenly things, and importantly, It is a mediatorial covenant and cleansing of a people. The structure of the feast had two components. The spring and fall type feasts, two components. And in those two components of the spring and fall, there are 7 feasts in all. The types had spring feasts. They relate to the first immutable thing, concerning the Son and the once for all sacrifice of necessity. The fall feasts relate to the second immutable thing, concerning his high priestly ministration, with the announcement, which is trumpets, of the coming yearly ministration, which is your Day of Atonements, Yom Kippur, which is necessary. And the final, the Feast of Tabernacles. The feasts. Here's a diagram. And you'll see that whether spring or fall, both are the everlasting gospel. In the spring, you had the Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Pentecost. These relate to the first immutable thing, Calvary, the cross, and shortly after, and why he was decreed to be a son, to fulfill Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Pentecost on Calvary, and shortly after. The fall feasts, in the fall of the year, the end of the year, trumpets, Day of Atonement, and Tabernacles. And that relates to the second mutable, the necessary, and why he, by an oath, became our great high priest. The reason why the spring and the fall feast changed from a literal observance is because the antitypical observance or focus must all be centered on considering what our great high priest has done and is doing for us now. Christ finished, which is what John 19:30 is about, on Calvary, the literal keeping of the feasts. He fulfills all the feasts antitypically through a series of divine prophetic appointments, the antitypical feasts, first on earth and then later in the heavenly sanctuary. So here is a link that takes you to the sanctuary service by M.L. Andreasen. This is a good read. And what we're going to find out when you survey the outline of the feast in type and how each feast was kept, you're going to find out it could only be kept by its accompanying animal sacrifice. In fact, you're going to find out that not one feast was ever kept without an accompanying animal sacrifice. They go hand in hand. Each could not be kept as a feast of the Lord without the divine requirement of the prescribed offering. It was commanded, ye shall. To do otherwise was disobedience. So here is a quote, a wrong assumption, from God's Festivals, Part 1, The Spring Festivals by Samuel Bakioki. A wrong assumption. A fourth surprise was to discover that I was wrong in assuming that the annual feast came to an end with the sacrifice of Christ, simply because they were connected with the sacrificial system of the temple. However, in view of this theological position by Bakioki, the following brief outline provides the Bible's own evidence of why God had ordered, instructed, and required that each feast be kept with an accompanying animal sacrifice, which totally refutes what Bakioki just said. Without any evidence whatsoever at that time or in succeeding times of the feasts themselves to ever be separated from their accompanying sacrifices of bulls and of goats, and in some cases their accompanying meal offerings. Here we have the Passover. The offering was the Paschal Lamb. Here's your text. Feast of Unleavened Bread, 4 burnt offerings, daily 2 bullocks, 1 ram, 7 lambs, with meal offerings, and 1 kid for a sin offering. The offering of first fruits, wave sheaf or omer of barley waved before the Lord, yearling lamb and its appropriate meal offering. Pentecost, 2 loaves to be waved, and 1 for the day, 2 bullocks, 1 ram, 7 lambs for burnt offering, meal offerings, 1 kid for a sin offering. Here's a bullock, here's 2 rams, there's 7 lambs there. Okay, 1 kid for sin offering, 2 lambs for peace offering. What's the pattern? There's not one feast that was kept or celebrated without an animal sacrifice. Next came the Feast of Trumpets. 1 bullock, 1 ram, 7 lambs. 1 kid for sin offering with the meal offerings. Day of Atonement, you had your daily burnt offering, bullock for a sin offering, a ram for a burnt offering for the priest, 2 goats for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering for the people. And for the day, 1 bullock, 1 ram, 7 lambs for a burnt offering, and 1 kid for a sin offering. Feast of Tabernacles. First day, there was 13 bullocks, 2 rams, 14 lambs, 1 kid. Each day thereafter, the number of bullocks is reduced by 1, until on the last day, the offering is 7 bullocks, 2 rams, 14 lambs, and 1 kid for a sin offering. So as one reads the festival requirements, you cannot help but see God's conclusive point, that for the ancient type feast, there were both animal and on certain feasts, meal offerings required in the very keeping of each feast. There is no way around this Bible fact. What was being illustrated? Christ, our Passover Lamb, was sacrificed for us. It all pointed to him. So here's the key to appreciating the feast. So what does all that mean? For those who think they can keep the feast without the meal and the animal sacrifices, isn't keeping the feast the way God commanded. The only other conclusion is to start sacrificing animals, which would deny Christ, our Passover sacrifice for us, as once for all sacrifice. To disobey and try and keep them, which becomes a works program. But there's one other option. Keep watching. Paul provided the conclusion of the type. In fact, there are to be no further sacrifices of bulls and goats, because they could not make the comers thereunto perfect as pertaining to the conscience. Because the offering of the body of Jesus Christ was once for all, and was all that was necessary for the heavenly things themselves to be cleansed. His once for all sacrifice and offering finished the sacrifices of bulls and goats. God is so clear. The sacrificial system of animals with the feast and the feast with those animals was finished. Dare it be said, blindness conjures up the notion the 10 Commandments were finished. This cannot be, as you will find out. We're to look up, for our redemption draweth nigh. We're told, look up to what? To our great high priest, because he fulfills all the feasts antitypically. And this is how you can truly keep the feasts antitypically. Paul directs our attention to consider Christ and his high priestly ministration, for it is he alone who fulfills and is fulfilling all the types. For in contrast today, there is the emphasis and popular teaching of feast keeping, and yet many say righteousness is by faith alone. And it is. But to keep the feast is to place one's hopes in the works of keeping the law of feasts, which has to include the sacrifice of animals, as we just learned. You can't have one without the other. And that's what results, as Paul stated, in a dead works program, rather than by faith serving the living God. If we draw the natural conclusion and choose to keep the Feast of Passover along with the type feast that followed it, then, according to the divine dictum of the sanctuary services and their connection to the annual feast, we need to offer a Passover lamb on a continual basis. But the fact is, in so doing, it blasphemes Christ and denies his once-for-all sacrifice of necessity by Christ our Passover. Do you see the problem that we face if we decide, oh, we've got to keep the feast? There is another option. And this is what the Bible is telling us. So some ask, since Christ fulfilled Passover and leavened bread, first fruits and Pentecost, why not keep those feasts that are not yet fulfilled? What is left, which means the fall feast, which is trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and Tabernacles. The problem continues. The feasts were ordained by God to be kept in association with the sacrifices of bulls and goats. Christ is the entire point in each of the antitypical feasts because of his sacrifice. 1 Corinthians 5:7 establishes this principle. That means that since this figure applies to one feast, it must apply to all the antitypical feasts. Christ, the wonderful number, gave clear instruction when the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary was to commence in Daniel 8:14. Because the feast of the Day of Atonement and the type had to have its corresponding antitypical fulfillment. Jesus is saying the antitypical would commence under his ministration when the 2300 days or years in Daniel 8:14 was fulfilled. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. In the classification of the 7 feasts, the Day of Atonement was grouped in the fall and not the spring metaphor. As has been shown, God has overwhelmingly stated the feasts themselves are types, which transition from a type to an antitype, from a literal observance of the feast to a spiritual observance. Here's your other option of the feast by faith. Christ's work has 2 major components. First, his earthly ministry, and then second, his high priestly ministration in heaven. These 2 components represent the spring with the first component, and the fall, the second component. And there is a transition from the earthly to the heavenly. And that's what Hebrews 8:5 is all about. What is the truth of the matter of the feast? Allow Paul to sum it up succinctly. He said, therefore, let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven. So, not typically, not literally. Neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now, if that doesn't transition from a literal to spiritual. Come on. The divine truth concerning the everlasting gospel as set out in Hebrews 8:5, which is the divine dictum that the service was an example and shadow of heavenly things. It lays down the cornerstone of truth for the type, because it said the priests served unto the example and shadow of heavenly things. The 7 annual feasts were given by God to Moses from Mount Sinai as part of that prophetic application of the Mediatorial Covenant. This is well stated as the law of Moses, my servant. Remember ye the law of Moses, my servant, as a spiritual consideration of what Christ is doing in the fulfillment of the spring, and importantly, fall feast. The fundamental point is this: ancient Israel's feasts reconcile Christ's antitypical high priest administration. They correspond to the two immutable things, and God cannot lie. The immutability that God cannot lie is based on the fact that the necessity and necessary are the very reasons why he became a son by decree and our antitypical Passover Lamb. And it was also decreed to be our great high priest by that oath after the order of Melchizedek. We will now consider two feasts. Passover was the spring feast, the beginning part of the year. The Day of Atonement was a fall feast. This was towards the end of the year. They are metaphors for Passover the spring is a metaphor for the atonement of forgiveness, was the necessity for Christ's Passover sacrifice in 31 AD. This was in the spring. The second one here, the Day of Atonement, was a metaphor for the Day of Atonement, the necessary cleansing that occurred in the fall. A metaphor corresponding to the putting away of sin by the sacrifice of himself in the end of the world, for a cleansing that will be so complete. Zechariah said it was to make men, any man, woman, or children, wondered at. But the erstwhile religious communities of today actually merged the fulfillment of the fall feast, the Day of Atonement, with the spring feast, Passover, as one event, by saying that the atonement was finished at the cross. This is not Bible. Central to the everlasting gospel is the sanctuary service. And this has just a little information shared on if you're having trouble sharing the everlasting gospel, the sanctuary message. The link for this thought paper, as well as the others that we'll be doing, is in the description box below. Many today have given no consideration to the spiritual dimension of Christ, represented in the spring and fall feasts. A brief review. The Passover type met its antitype with the death of Christ, our Passover Lamb on the cross, with deliverance from the bondage of sin by condemning sin in the flesh. Christ fulfilled unleavened bread. Through his burial, his body would not decay in the grave, because he condemned sin, the leaven in the flesh. The grave could not hold him to corruption. Christ fulfilled first fruits through his resurrection, being the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. Christ fulfilled Pentecost through his Spirit, the another comforter. When he appeared unto his disciples, he appeared unto the disciples with cloven tongues like as of fire. They began to speak with tongues. This resulted in a spiritual harvest of about 3,000 souls to the new and living way. All of this relates to the spring feast being the first immutable thing through his once for all sacrifice of necessity. And that must include a second or a dual atonement. The obvious conclusion is that he saith the new covenant. He hath made this first old mediatorial covenant, feast keeping and sacrifices, the sanctuary service. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. Then verily the first covenant, this old one, had also ordinance of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. So don't let anybody ever tell you that the first covenant was the 10 Commandments, when the Bible right here says the first, the old, was ordinances of divine service, sanctuary service, a worldly sanctuary, which included the feast and the animal sacrifices. The first or old covenant equals the ordinances of divine service in a worldly sanctuary. The book of Hebrews confirms the first was not the 10 Commandment covenant, which means it was the ordinances of divine service and includes the feast of a worldly sanctuary that decayed, waxed old, and vanished away. The new covenant includes Christ's high priestly ministration. Is it not time to consider our great high priest and what his high priestly work in the heavenly sanctuary entails? It cannot be said enough. Christ fulfilled these first 4 feasts in the beginning of the gospel age in 31 AD, starting with the spring feast of Passover. He being the true and final Passover Lamb of necessity, Christ our Passover, sacrificed for us. In summary, through his burial, resurrection, and outpouring of his Holy Spirit, he fulfilled the feast of unleavened bread, being the true unleavened bread in the garden tomb, and the first fruits being the first fruits and coming forth from the grave, that in all things he might have the preeminence. And Pentecost, he sent his Holy Spirit, the another comforter, the allos parakletos. First fruits being a type of Christ's triumphant resurrection and waving of the first fruits of them which slept and arose after his resurrection. Because remember, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose after his resurrection. They came out and went into the holy city and appeared unto many. The 7 annual feasts were given as an example and shadow of heavenly things, the everlasting gospel of ancient Israel. The first 4, which was Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Pentecost, have met their fulfillment antitypically through the necessity of Christ's sacrifice. This was the first immutable. What may be new for our readers to hear is that the first feast, trumpets, has already met its antitypical fulfillment. Its fulfillment ushered in the necessary final atonement ministration in the heavenly sanctuary, just as its fulfillment was an alerting call in the type by trumpets to prepare for the Day of Atonements. The event that signaled its fulfillment on earth coincided with the Great Awakening of the early 1800s and was well characterized by William Miller and then the Seventh Month Movement, who were studying Daniel 8:14. This antitypical fall feast of trumpets, the antitypical feast of the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles all relate to the second immutable thing. The oath, remember? Thou art a great high priest after the order of Melchizedek. The crucial antitypical fall feast, the Day of Atonements, commenced just as the man clothed in linen said it would, when the 2300 years were fulfilled. And that was not in the spring of 31 AD. The sixth feast, the Day of Atonement, remains to be fulfilled. We are in it right now, antitypically. The seventh feast, unfulfilled, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, is nigh on the horizon, when the tabernacle of God, Feast of Tabernacles, the tabernacle of God, will be with men. Look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Upward to the heavenly sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, not made with hands, where Christ, as our great high priest, second immutable, is ministering the last act of the final atonements. And that's why Hebrews 8:5 is the key to establishing the type and anytime link between the metaphorical application of the feast and the Mediatorial Covenant. So anyone asking you to join their feast-keeping church routine, tell them it's blasphemous to consider. And now it's high time to look up and look to and consider Christ, their great high priest, to look up to what's going on in the heavenly sanctuary, to what Christ is doing for them. Stay tuned for part number 2.